Ma'am Captain Morgan stood rigid, his spine straight, as if 20 years of instinct snapped back into place. The entire restaurant went still, and my brother froze his hand, still holding the handcuffs lowered, as his face drained of color. Just 10 minutes earlier, I was the usual background character at another family dinner, quietly sipping iced tea, while Ethan, my brother, held court. He had just earned his sergeant stripes at the precinct, and our parents were beaming like he'd won a war. I was the afterthought as always. Then he noticed the badge clipped to my belt. Impersonating a federal officer. Now he scoffed. "You know that's a felony, right?" He stood. Loud, confident, triumphant. "I'm placing you under arrest," he declared. And just like that, he called in Captain Morgan to verify my identity. I didn't argue. I didn't flinch. I simply placed the badge on the table, dark blue, subtle real. And when the captain walked in and saw it, he didn't ask questions. He saluted. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just let the truth do what it always does arrive. I used to believe family would eventually understand you once you accomplished enough, once you earned it. But that was a story I told myself, a fairy tale of merit and recognition. In truth, my family saw only what they wanted, and what they saw in me was always less. My brother Ethan had always been the star, the loud one, the brave one, the one who brought home stories that made people laugh and lean forward, nodding along like fans at a one-man show. Even when we were little, his scraped knees were badges of honor. My perfect report cards were quietly filed away and forgotten. The gap widened after college. I entered government service, though I couldn't say much more than that. Ethan joined the police academy. That made sense to them: uniforms, flashing lights, news stories about local heroes. It was easy to explain. It made my father proud. He used to tell people Ethan's the one out there making a difference. As for me, she's in government. Something to do with files. Not really sure. No one ever asked. No one really wanted to know. I remember Ethan's graduation from the academy like it happened last week. The backyard was packed. Balloons, cheap beer, my father's prized barbecue ribs. Neighbors dropped by with gifts and unsolicited job advice. Ethan, all shine and swagger in his crisp blue uniform, stood in the center of it all like a monument to someone else's expectations fulfilled. At one point, my father tapped a fork against his glass and called for attention. I knew what was coming. The speech, the pride, the absolute clarity in his voice as he said, "To Ethan, our real protector, the one who chose something noble, something visible." The word visible burned. What no one knew, because I couldn't tell them, was that the very morning of Ethan's graduation, I had received something too. It came in a thick white envelope, no return address. Inside was my official clearance notification and onboarding packet, a direct commission into a Tier 1 strategic intelligence unit, one that doesn't advertise its name, one that doesn't appear in public rosters. I had gone through months of background checks, psychological evaluations, polygraphs, interviews I couldn't tell even my friends about. I'd made it, but I was invisible. That night, I pulled my mother aside. She was in the kitchen, washing dishes slowly, the way she always did when the party noise was too much. I remember holding the packet like it was proof of my existence. "I got accepted," I whispered. "It's not just a job. It's a long-term assignment, a permanent track, strategic intel." She barely looked at the papers, just patted my hand the way she always did, warm, soft, and somehow completely distant. "That's wonderful, dear," she said without a pause. "But today is Ethan's day. Let's not distract, okay?" That was the moment I stopped trying to be seen, not out of bitterness, out of survival. From that point forward, I built a life inside another world, a world where being unseen meant doing something right, where recognition came in glances across classified briefings, not applause, where no one gave toasts, but every word you spoke could move real lives, shift real danger. I was no longer just the quiet one. In that world, I had a name no one in my family would ever say aloud. I was General Vance. But back at the dinner table, I was still just Jenna, the one who works in some federal cubicle. Holidays were the worst. Ethan would take over every room, every conversation. He had the stories, the sirens, the close calls. He told them with flair. He stood while telling them using the salt shaker as a prop if needed. My parents hung on every word like he was their favorite show. One Thanksgiving, I had just returned from a 72-hour joint op with NATO analysts. I hadn't slept in days. I'd run simulations that had redirected fleet movements and probably prevented a regional escalation. But when my father asked how work was, I just smiled and said, "Still in the office." That's what he could understand. An office, a desk, a daughter who made enough to get by. Sometimes I think that was easier for them, to believe I had settled, that I was quiet because I had nothing to say. They never considered I was quiet because I knew too much to speak. Over time, I accepted my role in their version of the story. Ethan was the decorated cop. I was the dependable, invisible support character, the one who always offered to do the dishes, the one who left early without making a scene, the one they could count on not to outshine anyone, until that dinner. Until Ethan stood up and accused me loudly publicly of impersonating someone I had spent my whole life quietly becoming. That night, something shifted. It wasn't anger exactly. It was deeper. A quiet undoing. I no longer felt the need to translate my life into their language. I no longer wanted them to understand. I simply wanted the truth to be seen once by someone who knew what they were looking at. They didn't need to know who I was. But Captain Morgan did, and that would be enough. The restaurant wasn't fancy, but it was full the kind of place our family went when my parents wanted to celebrate something that made them feel successful. And tonight, that thing was Ethan's promotion to sergeant. He chose the table, of course. Dead center. He liked an audience. We had just finished our appetizers when he leaned back with a smug smile and launched into another story, this one about a DUI arrest that involved a chase and a pepper spray malfunction. My parents laughed so hard they had to dab their eyes. I sipped my iced tea and nodded politely, doing my usual impression of wallpaper. Then he turned to me. I felt it before he spoke, that tightening in the air, the way a storm sometimes builds in silence before the thunder. So he said, raising one eyebrow, still organizing file cabinets for Uncle Sam. It wasn't the words. It was the tone, the intentional belittling dressed up as a joke. I felt both of my parents go very still, then immediately reach for their glasses, pretending not to hear it. They'd seen this movie before. "It's more complicated than that," I said calmly. Ethan let out a theatrical snort. "Oh, I'm sure. Alphabetizing classified coffee orders is probably a high-level operation." My father chuckled. My mother smiled tightly. It didn't sting the way it used to. I'd built up scar tissue, but still, somewhere inside a familiar ledger quietly recorded the entry. Then Ethan's eyes dropped to my hip, where my jacket had shifted just enough for my badge to be visible. He froze for half a second, then his expression changed, not to curiosity, but to opportunity. "Hold on," he said, voice louder now. "What the hell is that?" I glanced down. "Federal identification," I said evenly. He stood, just stood right there at the table. "Are you serious right now? Are you carrying a fake badge?" "Jenna, you do know impersonating a federal officer is a felony." His voice wasn't loud, not yet, but it carried. Conversations around us began to slow. My mother whispered, "Ethan, please." He ignored her. "You know what, I'm done with this. I'm calling my captain. You can explain your little cosplay project to him." He was pulling out his phone now, waving it like some kind of gavel. My father sat straighter, suddenly uncomfortable. "Ethan, sit down," he muttered. "No. She needs to learn you can't walk around with fake credentials like it's a game. This is serious." There it was. The moment he thought he could finally put me in my place, permanently, publicly. He had no idea what world he'd just stepped into. I didn't argue. I didn't panic. I didn't try to stop him. I let him make the call, because I knew something he didn't. He thought he was the law, but I knew the law he answered to. Captain Morgan was not just his superior. He was a liaison officer with joint military police training. He'd been through cross-agency protocol briefings. He'd seen federal credentials, real ones. He'd been taught how to read them. And more importantly, he'd been taught what not to ignore. Ethan was about to hand-deliver me, the one person in his entire chain of command who would understand exactly what I was, and what Ethan had just done. So I sat back, still, calm, letting the silence press in. My mother reached for my hand under the table, squeezed it once, then withdrew, unsure who she was supposed to be protecting. My father avoided my eyes. Ethan stayed standing. His voice grew louder as he explained to Captain Morgan that his sister, that would be me, was at the restaurant carrying what he claimed was a fake badge and posing as federal personnel. He sounded triumphant, puffed up, righteous. I didn't say a word. Instead, I unclipped the badge from my hip. Quietly, carefully, and I placed it on the tablecloth next to my water glass face up. It didn't shimmer. It didn't shine. It didn't need to. It was a dark blue rectangle matte polymer, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know how to read its language. But in the bottom corner, just above the embedded chip, was a small holographic insignia, a 7-pointed star encased in a silver ring. Below it, a thin colored band coded for clearance level. To my parents, it was a toy. To Ethan, it was a prop. To someone trained, it was a door. All we had to do now was wait. I folded my hands in my lap and listened to the soft hum of conversation returning around us. People were watching, but no one intervened. Ethan stood like a soldier before a court-martial he didn't know he was about to face. We sat in a strange, frozen kind of silence, the kind that feels heavy, as if even the air had too much to carry. My mother had stopped trying to say anything. My father picked at the condensation on his glass like it could offer him a way out of the moment. And Ethan stood there, arms crossed, phone still in his hand, convinced that his version of the truth was about to be vindicated. But deep down, I think even he felt it, that something was shifting. Not in the air around us, but in the ground beneath him. He just didn't know what yet. I had spent my life navigating these silences. When I was young, it was the silence of being passed over, of having no stories worth telling, of having your achievements praised politely, then forgotten before dessert. Later, it was the silence of not being able to share anything, of reading intelligence reports about global threats while smiling through Thanksgiving dinner, pretending I didn't know what was brewing in the Eastern Hemisphere. It wasn't the secrets that were hard. It was pretending they didn't matter. Because in their world, Ethan's traffic stops were more real than my global briefings. His radio calls were louder than my encrypted transmissions. His badge was something you could show off. Mine had to be explained, and explanations never landed. Not when the story had already been written without me in it. I remember once, after a grueling 16-hour day coordinating counterintel between 2 allied defense departments, I called my mother just to hear a familiar voice. Just to remember I wasn't invisible. She told me Ethan had been mentioned in a local paper. He'd pulled a kid out of a crashed car. There was a picture. He'd smiled. The headline called him a hometown hero. She was proud, glowing. I said I was proud of him too. And I meant it. But when she asked how work was, I hesitated. I couldn't say I'm one of 5 people in a war room trying to prevent a diplomatic incident in the Baltics. So instead, I said, busy. Mostly spreadsheets. And she said, well, at least it's stable. You've always liked order. That was how they saw me. Neat, predictable, a steady daughter, a safe one. Not someone who made decisions that rippled across continents. And so I kept my world separate. Not out of resentment, out of necessity. Out of the quiet understanding that trying to explain it would only make it smaller in their eyes. But tonight, the line had been crossed. This wasn't just a joke gone too far. This was Ethan in full uniform, using his badge to assert control over me publicly, loudly, arrogantly. It wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. Even off-duty, my clearance level came with protections, legal, operational, and national. By escalating the situation the way he had, Ethan had unwittingly tripped protocols he didn't even know existed. He thought he was catching me in a lie. He had no idea he was the one under scrutiny now. And still, I felt hollow. Not because I was afraid I wasn't, not even close, but because the people at this table, my family, had never really seen me, and now that they would, it would be through the lens of humiliation. Not mine, Ethan's. I didn't want it to be like this. I had spent years imagining a moment where they'd finally understand, where I'd sit down, hand them a redacted letter or a medal in a case, and they'd say, "We're sorry we never asked. We're proud of you." But no such moment ever came. Because they had built a story that only worked if I stayed small, and I had complied until tonight. I glanced at my badge on the table. The soft glow of the overhead light caught its edges just right. It looked quiet, unassuming, but it was real, just like me. The front door opened. A small gust of wind trailed in, and with it Captain Morgan. He wasn't impressive looking, not at first glance. Average height, a bit of a slouch, eyes tired in the way that said he'd seen more than he wanted to, but not enough to quit. He moved like someone who hated paperwork and dinner interruptions equally. His eyes swept the room once. Ethan waved to him like a kid in a spelling bee who finally knew the answer. "Captain over here," he called out. I didn't move. Captain Morgan approached the table slowly. His eyes flicked from my parents to Ethan, then to the badge on the table. He stopped. Not like someone confused, but like someone who had just realized they were in the wrong room. The air shifted. I felt it. Ethan didn't. Not yet. Captain Morgan leaned in slightly, examining the badge without touching it. His expression changed subtly but unmistakably. His back straightened, his jaw tensed, and then his eyes met mine. Recognition. He knew what it was. He knew what I was. Ethan was still talking, still gesturing. Captain Morgan didn't even blink. In another life, I might have tried to stop this. I might have stepped in, smoothed it over, let Ethan save face. But something in me had gone still. Not cold, still. Like the surface of deep water that hides something vast beneath. Captain Morgan's gaze lingered on the badge just long enough to be certain. Then he straightened fully his shoulders, squaring with military precision, a motion not of surprise but of confirmation, the kind of posture only those who've worn more than one uniform ever remember. "General Vance," he said the words sharp, deliberate. "I apologize for my officer's conduct. Is there an issue?" It wasn't loud, but it landed like a hammer. My mother gasped. My father's fork hit his plate with a dull clink. And Ethan, he just stared, as if the word general had been spoken in a language he'd never learned. Captain Morgan turned to him finally directly and said nothing. He didn't need to. That was when I made the decision. No anger, no vengeance, just clarity. I would not explain. I would not translate. I would simply act as I was trained to through structure protocol and precise calibration of consequence. I turned to the captain. "There's no ongoing issue," I said quietly, "but I recommend Sergeant Miller receive a full refresher on interagency deconfliction protocols, especially regarding Title 18 and contact with senior DoD command staff." Captain Morgan's expression didn't change, but I saw the flicker, the instant professional understanding of what that meant. This wasn't a family squabble. This was now a procedural failure logged, noted, and handled. His eyes snapped to Ethan, who took an involuntary half-step back. "Miller, Captain Morgan said, voice low, dangerous. My car." "Now." "But," Ethan started. "Now." There was no yelling, no scene. Just a silence so thick you could feel it tighten around the entire restaurant. Ethan looked at me like I had become something monstrous. He didn't understand. He couldn't. He had spent a lifetime measuring power in arrests, in headlines, in likes on department Facebook posts. He didn't know the kind of power that moved silently, the kind that never needed to announce itself because it was woven into the fabric of operations far beyond his jurisdiction. Captain Morgan escorted him out, one firm hand on his shoulder. My parents remained seated. Neither of them looked at me. Not really. My mother was pale, blinking too much. My father, the man who once toasted Ethan as our real protector, was rigid, angry. Not at Ethan, but at the rupture of a narrative he had built and believed for decades. A narrative where I was quiet because I was lesser. Where I worked behind a desk because I wasn't capable of more. Where Ethan was the warrior, and I was invisible. I had never tried to change that narrative, not really. I had lived beside it, endured it, swallowed it, but I had never challenged it until now. And the truth was, I hadn't planned this confrontation. I hadn't come to dinner to be revealed. But when Ethan tried to arrest me when he turned a family dinner into a public spectacle, he handed me the one thing I'd never had permission to stop pretending. So I did. And in doing so, I discovered something even more important. I no longer needed them to see me. I wasn't exposing myself to be validated. I was letting them witness at last the consequences of refusing to look. I folded my napkin slowly and set it on the table. I have a briefing early tomorrow, I said quietly. No one stopped me. No one spoke. I left enough cash to cover the bill and a generous tip. Then I turned and walked out of the restaurant into the night air. No one followed, and for the first time in my life, that felt like peace. Captain Morgan filed the incident within the week. It wasn't a dramatic affair, no headlines, no fallout that would make its way to family group chats or community gossip. But inside the system Ethan loved so much, the one he wore like armor, a record had been created. It was short, precise, clinical. A supervisory referral recommending retraining in interagency conflict handling and misuse of authority tied to a code-level designation that Ethan undoubtedly wouldn't recognize. It wasn't disciplinary, not outwardly, but it was permanent. A quiet mark. I didn't write it. I didn't need to. The structure I served in did that for me. Systems, after all, don't require emotion to function. Just data. 3 weeks passed. I didn't hear from Ethan, not directly, but I heard from my mother. She called one afternoon tentative and measured her voice brittle with something she didn't quite name. Your brother, he's upset. He feels embarrassed. He didn't know. You could have just told us. It wasn't a question. It was a plea. Not for Ethan, but for the narrative to hold together a little longer. I stayed silent on the line long enough for her to fill the space. He's your brother, Jenna. He was trying to protect something. Maybe you overreacted. That one sat quietly between us. And I let it sit, because I knew with absolute certainty that to speak would invite her to misunderstand me again, this time in even deeper ways. So I changed the subject. We hung up a few minutes later. She didn't bring it up again, but Ethan did. A week later, he appeared outside the federal building where I worked. How he got through the initial security screening, I still don't know. Probably someone recognized the badge and thought the resemblance meant he belonged. I was notified discreetly. There's a Sergeant Miller here. Says he's your brother. He's waiting in the lobby. I could have refused. I should have. But something inside me wanted to see what version of himself he'd bring this time. He was waiting near the glass entrance, shoulders, stiff jaw set. He looked like he'd rehearsed the moment in his head a dozen times, and none of the versions had gone well. He stood when I walked in. Hey! Ethan! We hadn't said each other's names aloud in years. He looked at the lanyard around my neck, the clearance designation tucked inside, half obscured by the badge reader. I didn't hide it. He didn't pretend not to see. Listen, he started, then paused. I didn't know. About that. I know. You could have told me. Would you have believed me? He didn't answer right away. I thought you were just, background. There it was, the honest mistake, the quiet dismissal, the casual inheritance of superiority. I nodded, not in agreement, in acknowledgement. I know, I said again. He shifted uncomfortably. Look, I got reassigned for a bit. Admin stuff. Morgan won't look at me. Guys at the precinct, they heard. His voice faltered. I said nothing. This isn't who I thought you were. No, I said, calm and clear. It's who I've always been. You just didn't want to know. He looked away, down at his hands. Are you mad at me? No. He looked up, hopeful for a moment. I'm done needing anything from you, I said gently. That's not anger. That's peace. There was no drama, no screaming, just understanding, the painful kind. You should go, I added. You're not cleared for this floor. He blinked once, then turned quietly and left. I stood there until the doors closed behind him, then turned and walked back to the briefing room where an encrypted conference line was waiting. A new operation had just come across my desk. 3 flags: cross-agency, time-sensitive. I sat down, headset in place, posture composed. No longer someone Ethan had to see, just someone he could never unsee again. The moment Ethan left the building, I thought that would be it. Not because the story was finished, but because I didn't need it to continue. I'd said what needed saying, and more importantly, I'd said nothing else. The silence itself had done the work, but the system doesn't let things end quietly. Not when signatures are involved. Not when someone has forced a chain of protocol into motion. And certainly not when a federal-level ID has been publicly challenged by a local officer. A month after the incident, a closed-door session convened, not disciplinary, but procedural. Internal Affairs, in coordination with our department's legal liaison, requested a formal debrief on the restaurant event for record-keeping. It was standard, expected, thorough. The report would be classified anonymized for any public systems but available to certain branches of law enforcement for precedent and training. And in that room, I had to do something I'd never done before. I had to narrate a version of myself not in operational language, not through coded reports or signal intercepts, but plainly in words even Ethan would have understood. I spoke with precision. I gave dates, times, context. The subject, Sergeant Ethan Miller, initiated a public confrontation during off-duty hours, escalating to attempted detainment of a credentialed officer operating under Tier 1 federal clearance. The situation was neutralized through standard identification protocol and chain of command recognition by his supervising officer. That was it. That was all it needed to be. The panel nodded. One of them, a civilian legal advisor, looked over his glasses and said, "This is rare." I didn't respond. It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't an insult. It was just fact. When I left the room, I felt lighter, not because anything had changed, but because everything already had. 3 weeks later, I was briefing a select unit at the Pentagon on international cyber intrusion trends. The kind of session where everyone's faces stay impassive, but their minds are moving fast. These were people like me who operated in silence, who understood the gravity of information without needing headlines or applause. Afterward, a colleague handed me a thin envelope with a simple note from legal. "You're cleared to view the case file." I didn't open it right away. I wasn't sure I wanted to. That night in my apartment, a place with clean lines and no photographs, I slid the report out. The name was redacted in most sections as expected, but I didn't need to read names to know who had filed the addendum. It was a letter. Short, contrite. The tone was familiar in that clumsy, overly formal way people write when they're trying to sound like they aren't falling apart. It read, "I never should have done what I did. I thought I was right. I thought I was helping. I didn't know what I didn't know. I understand now that I overstepped. I humiliated you. I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need it on record that you didn't deserve what I did." I stared at it for a long time, not because it moved me, but because it didn't. This was the moment I'd once imagined Ethan finally realizing the depth of his blindness, not just about me, but about himself, the moment where the golden brother facade cracked just enough to let light through. And yet I felt nothing. Not triumph, not vindication, just closure. Quiet, steady, complete. That letter wasn't for me. It was for the record, for the file, for history, maybe not for the heart. And I was okay with that, because the most powerful part of this story wasn't that Ethan had finally seen who I was. It was that I no longer needed him to. I never replied to Ethan's letter, not because I couldn't, but because it didn't need a response. Some stories don't end with reconciliation. Some don't end with a hug or a phone call or a shared holiday table where everything is suddenly healed. Some stories end in silence, a kind that feels final, not empty. It had taken years to understand that silence isn't always absence. Sometimes it's protection. Sometimes it's the boundary that keeps you whole. My life moved forward, not dramatically, not suddenly, but with a quiet confidence that came from no longer holding out hope for something I didn't need. At work, nothing changed. My role remained the same: oversight on cross-agency strategy, long hours spent buried in secure briefings, and late-night calls that came without names, only coordinates and clearances. But internally, everything was different. The emotional split that had lived inside me, the version of myself that shrank in my family's presence, that softened her edges to remain acceptable, she was gone. Quietly retired, no ceremony. I didn't need to prove myself anymore. Not to them. Not to anyone. 6 months after the dinner, I attended a formal ceremony at Arlington. A military analyst I'd worked with for years was being honored posthumously. The air was heavy with reverence. Names were read aloud with a kind of solemn dignity that made you stand straighter without realizing it. Afterward, I stood alone near the back watching the families gather. I wasn't there to be seen. Most people didn't even know my name, only my role, and that was how it was supposed to be. A younger officer approached me quietly, Lieutenant Carr, new to the unit. "General," he said carefully, "I just wanted to say, your call on Operation Daedalus saved lives. A lot of us studied that decision in briefing last month. It changed the way I think about chain of command trust." I nodded, accepting the compliment not as praise, but as passing confirmation, the kind you get used to in this line of work. "We make the hard calls," I said simply. "The job isn't to be understood. It's to be right when it matters." He nodded and left. That was all I needed. A quiet echo of purpose. My world had narrowed into clarity. Weeks later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, I saw Ethan's name flash on the caller ID of my private phone. I didn't pick up. There was no anger behind the decision, just peace. I let it ring out, then turned the phone face down on the counter. I stood at the window watching the city stretch below. Somewhere, a siren blared, maybe a car crash, maybe a theft. Somewhere, Ethan might be responding, clipboard and hand badge on chest, still trying to protect a world he thought he understood. And that was fine. He had his purpose. I had mine. We were not enemies. We were not even estranged. We were simply complete. Our story had reached its end. Or maybe it had just stopped needing a continuation. That night I filed away the letter he'd written me. Not to destroy it, not to cherish it, just to archive it. It became part of a record like so many others I'd written, received, or read. A detail, a point of data. Filed, processed, closed. Then I turned back to my desk where a new case file was waiting. New intel, new stakes, new mission. And I smiled, not because I had won anything, but because I had finally fully let go of needing to. In the end, my brother tried to arrest me because he didn't understand who I was. His own captain showed him. And I walked away. If you've ever been underestimated by the people who should have known better, know this: your rank doesn't need to be spoken. Your story doesn't need their applause. You already carry it quietly, completely.